So the US elections are now finally over. Essentially, they are. After having been dragged out for several days, we now know that it's going to be Joe Biden who is going to be the president of the United States for the next, at least for the next 4 years. Now, despite that, the fact that it's very clear that Joe Biden has won the election, Trump is not going to make this easy. He's not going to actually admit defeat. He'll send an army of lawyers. He'll pull out every single dirty trick he can think of in order to try to remain in office or delay the transition of power for as long as he can, because he is simply incapable of acting like an adult. There are people that are immature, and then there are people whose ego is so large that they are incapable of functioning like a mature adult. And that is what I believe Trump's problem is. So already we're hearing nonstop barrages from Trump and his cultist followers saying how the election was rigged, while showing zero evidence of it whatsoever. Unless you count an inability to count being it. Of course, there are sudden jumps in the number of people who have ballots have been counted because they count them a batch at a time. Because you can't just put all the ballots on the table at once. You have to individually count them. And I believe it's about, in the case of Pennsylvania, they could count about 13,000 ballots an hour. So you understand why they would do waves and then break for lunch and then do a couple more waves and come back the next day and do a couple more waves. That's how a number can suddenly go up, because once that wave is done, they report that to the media. I don't think that it's unsurprising that the mail-in votes, the majority of them, were by Democrats, because they're more concerned about COVID than Republicans are. So to say that, oh, they're all just fake ballots coming in by mail is complete nonsense. There's no evidence of this in any way, shape, or form. It's an outright baseless claim. Even Trump saying that you can't count ballots past the actual election day is false. It's not true. And even if it were true, don't you think the people who voted, I mean, at least if you think the U.S. is a democracy, that wouldn't you want those votes to be counted if you believed in democracy, even if it's someone who didn't vote the same way you did? But that's not what's going on here. These Trumpers will believe anything. You can tell them anything, and they will believe it. Trump can manufacture all kinds of false claims about this election all he wants. But it doesn't change the fact that he lost. He lost fair and square the same way he won fair and square in the last election. There is no amount of twisting the truth or making up lies that is going to fundamentally change that. And that's the way it is. If this tells us anything, it tells us the dysfunctional nature of U.S. democracy. In order for a bourgeois democracy to work, people have to believe that it does. And if people don't believe in a democracy, is it even one? You have to give it at least that veneer that it's legitimate. Now, a couple of times that veneer has worn off. Say in 2000, when the Supreme Court decided that Bush should be the president rather than the actual votes. What's happening here is that despite there being complete legitimacy to the vote, people have decided that it's not real. It's not rigged, you're just losing. But that is the reality we face with this election. Whether the votes are legitimate or not is secondary to the perception of whether it is or not. And that's what matters. They don't believe that the country is a democracy. I'm referring to the Trumpers. They don't believe that they can actually lose. That reeks of so much cultish behavior that it's simply ridiculous. It's beyond reason. To believe that you are incapable of failing, you cannot lose, is not possible, is nothing more than idealism in the greatest degree. And that's what the Trumpers are doing right now. Idealism to that greatest degree. And that's what's frightening. That they truly believe that reality is something that is perceived as a roadblock to what they believe. Now tell me that's not idealism. Of course it is. Now what did we learn throughout this whole election? What did we really get? Nothing of substance is going to change. Nothing is going to be that fundamentally different. There might be a little bit more health coverage. The existing conditions thing might reappear. But other than that, the system isn't going to change. The rich will still get richer, and the poor will still get poorer. And you can bank on that. All the way to the banks that really control the political scene. But there is a genuine idea that people believe that Trump is an anti-imperialist candidate. But I ask, exactly what wars came to an end because of Trump? What less hostile foreign policy came about as of Trump? Many would be quick to point to the DPRK and say, look, it was much more friendly. Not one sanction was removed. Only new ones were added. Nothing happened there. Every meeting was just a photo op for Trump. Kim Jong-un didn't get any concessions. He got a meeting with a sitting U.S. president. That was it. Not one thing in the DPRK got better because Trump was there. And despite all his rhetoric about wanting to make things better and Kim Jong-un's a great guy and all that, nothing changed. And that's what's important here. No wars came to an end. And to also address this idea that somehow Trump was the anti-imperialist candidate, why don't you ask Soleimani if he's the anti-imperialist candidate? I think it's fair to say that Trump was not consistent with his policy, foreign policy. It was not consistent. It was very scatterbrained. Like he didn't know what he was doing and was just knee-jerk reacting to things and did not have a comprehensive foreign policy plan, which I think it's safe to say he didn't have. This does not make for anti-imperialism. Not doing war makes for anti-imperialism. A legitimate resistance to war makes it anti-imperialism. Because as I'm sure everybody saw, except the radical liberals who tried to pass themselves off as left, the bombs kept falling. The bodies kept piling up, and the puppet governments remained, except for Bolivia. And that was because their own anti-imperialist struggle stopped it. So I really don't buy this argument that somehow Trump is the anti-imperialist candidate. It's just, there's no anti-war. There's no stopping war, even reducing it, to be found. And I think that's a fair criticism to make of that. So what can we say Trump was? What can we rightfully label him as? Many have tried to call him a fascist. Maybe. Certainly a lot of fascist tendencies in there. A lot of totalitarian tendencies in there that would tear the face off of even U.S. democracy. But I think it would be better to look at Trump as the accelerationist candidate. And if you support accelerationism, you would be the guy to vote for. 4 more years of Trump policy might have been just what would be needed to destroy the U.S. empire. And it's not something that I would lose any sleep over. In all honesty, you would want Trump to win in order to essentially destroy the U.S. empire, and that's what I would want. But other people are going to have different positions. You know mine. Mine's going to be the third worldist position, and that's looking for the political and economic collapse of the first world in order to make things better for the third world. But other people don't necessarily see it that way. Some of them are riding with Biden because they're going to get the nice, well, I was going to say free stuff, but he didn't promise the free stuff. That's Bernie Sanders who does that. It's interesting how this so-called radical left, the ContraPoints, the Destinies, the god-awful Vosh, would see it as a move left to return to normalcy. The regular everyday evil that is the U.S. empire is what's considered an achievement. That's something to be sought after. Because they really are only thinking about themselves in the end. They're only thinking about whether or not they can get a little bit more, or the rich get taxed just a little bit more for however long that increase in taxes actually lasts. I don't know how you could genuinely be anti-imperialist and stand for the continuation of the United States. It is a country that was built on evil. The evil of Christian fundamentalism. Not all Christians. Christian fundamentalism. Born out of slavery and genocide. There never was a good America. There never was an exceptional America. There never was a good old days. America was never a good thing. Uncle Sam always was a goose-stepping imperialist. Always has been, always will be. That's what America is. And no amount of saying, yeah, but look at this one guy in the past who was an exception. People often point to W.E.B. Du Bois. So what? Does that mean that the United States is fundamentally changed? Does that mean that even if he had won, that it was that it would no longer be an imperialist power? What do you think would happen if an anti-imperialist candidate actually got into power? There might be an accident and he mysteriously dies, forced out of office by some kind of controversy. There is no voting this out. It's not going to happen. To stand for anti-imperialism is to stand against the United States and everything that it is and everything that it has ever claimed to be. I know I do often like to make that statement that there is no saving America because there was never anything to save. You're either against the empire of evil or you're latching onto it because it's beneficial to you. And that's something I think a lot of people really don't understand. They don't get that. They still think that they can turn the empire of evil into something else. Do you know what the term radical means? Radical means to go to the roots, to go right down to the very basis of something, its roots, tear it up, and change it with something else. America could not, as a progressive force, as a proper force, could not exist as it is. The whole thing would have to be dug up from the roots and replaced with something entirely new. There is no voting to, I mean, there is no pointing to FDR and his, throwing Japanese people into internment camps and thinking that's socialism because he was going to make some kind of concession. There is no pointing to Marx celebrating Abraham Lincoln for ending slavery and thinking, "Oh, that makes Lincoln a Marxist now because he mentioned that labor was important this one time." Because nothing says Marxism and overthrowing the system like literally preserving the system from a civil war. But people are so terribly intent upon trying to preserve some kind of idea as America as something good, something that can be saved, something that can be turned into something else. It can't. It has to be destroyed and replaced with something that's actually good. And that's the crossroads that American Marxists are at right now. This is what they have to decide. What are you going to do? Are you going to be a part of the problem or are you going to be a part of the solution? Because I remember an old phrase from the show Malcolm in the Middle, when Malcolm was battling one of his Crailborn teachers. He said, "No, I can't beat the system, but I can break it." To circle back to where I started, let me just remind you of how fractured U.S. society is now. You have people, a very, very large portion of people, who literally believe there's a conspiracy to keep Trump out of the White House. And not that he may have suffered from his own incompetence. The fact that he could not care how many Americans die from COVID, etc. The real face is off the phony face is off the American people, where you've got half of the population literally doesn't believe COVID is a real thing, and that numbers are completely made up in order to control people by a system who they support the guy who's in charge of, who's not a part of the conspiracy, even though he actually runs the system that's doing the conspiracy. All kinds of mental gymnastics you would need. Think about this. I want you to realize how bad it really is and how reactionary, you could say, even a majority of the U.S. population is. Not even just the regular don't even want a revolution, but want Nazi Germany. That's exactly what they were pushing. That's what they have been pushing. And Trump emboldened them to do that. It's a cliche now. How could something like that happen? This is how it happens. I mean, that's been said so many times now. But it's true. This is how it happens. Fascism will look different in every country. I don't believe that there's any one solid way fascism will look across all countries and all points in history. But understand how very close that came. Trump may refuse to leave office now, but in the end he's not going to win because the electorate didn't ask for it. Had the electorate actually asked for it, he would have made sure that he could run a third time. And all of this for years have been building towards a real Nazi empire, not just in act, but also in substance. Make America Great Again came so close to being the real Sieg Heil. That's how close it came. The parallels between the way Trumpers act and the way people were acting when the Nazis came to power, it's so... All the warning signs are there. And if you don't see it at this point, you don't want to. So just remember, just because you got the Joe Biden in, doesn't mean that this is gone. They're still there. Every single, Trump flag that's a stand-in for the swastika is still there. They didn't go away. You can get rid of Trump's picks in office, but the very heart of fascism in the American people is still there. And that's not going to go away so easily. The next guy that comes along who sounds like Trump, who acts like Trump, he's going to pick up that mantle again. Now, we've always known that the Republican Party had that fascist streak through it. Although sometimes you couldn't see it. But with Trump, it really came out. And maybe not the Republican Party itself, but the base that which votes for it. They are the ones with fascism in their heart. And that's not going to go away just because Sleepy Joe's in the office. That threat is always going to be there. The 3%ers, the Michigan militia, all them and the rest of the white supremacist groups, they're all going to be there. The day after Trump steps out of office, they'll still be there. They'll still be clutching their guns, waiting for an opportunity to rise again. And that is the real threat that America faces. Not Iran, not Venezuela, not Bolivia, but the threat that's inside. And that's the battle that still has to be fought. And that's something the American people have to decide if they're going to fight or not. That battle is up to you. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.